Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review PUER by Current Value. Brand new album from possibly my favorite drum and bass artist of all time, Tim Elliott aka Current Value. This one is his debut on Souped Up Records, a quite recent drum and bass neurofunk label where Current Value releases his debut, and this is actually the first full-length release that we see from this label. Current Value's connection with Souped Up Records started with the release of the EP City Syndrome, which was an EP that went to your standard formula of drum and bass and neurofunk music that you see from Current Value recently. It didn't add something new or refreshing, but it was a quite decent release. It was a really solid EP. And I was looking forward to this new release from Current Value because I'm a huge fan of his works. Even if his most recent outputs are not as legendary or as impressive as some of his first works, we're still talking about an artist that has developed himself a lot over the years, and his new direction with neurofunk music playing over the past couple of years is really incredible. And also Current Value has teased a second release for this year coming this December, being his full-length debut on Meth Lab Recordings, where he initially going to portray a different side of himself. So basically these two albums are two of his different sides as his whole progression and his development as an artist throughout all of these years. So what we have over here is a 15-track LP going for over an hour of material, which is something quite standard for Current Value having some long-winded albums. The tracks are still more relatively short, going for about 4 or 5 minutes long, and this is a quite interesting album, and I can easily say that this is one of the darkest albums that he has done in a very long time. While it still has lots of intense neurofunk tracks and lots of them are quite catchy and danceable, I think there is a sense and a vibe on this album that you don't catch that easily with some of his previous works. This one is definitely darker than Biocellulose, and it's definitely darker than Deadly Toys, which was a bit of a more one-dimensional album. It was way too straightforward, going entirely on a neurofunk direction. However, PUER is definitely one of the most varied and most versatile albums Current Value has ever put out, like ever. For example, the album starts with Starliner, which is a track that I was expecting to go into this more intense neurofunk direction, but instead we go into a more standard drum and bass formula, which is not something that unique for Current Value in recent years, but I still don't think that we have heard so many tracks from Tim Elliott like this one. Starliner actually feels closer to liquid drum and bass or atmospheric drum and bass, which is a really nice surprise because this track is quite amazing. I love the female vocals, I love the atmosphere to this track. This is a really beautiful drum and bass song, and it was definitely something that I would not expect, especially for the beginning on the album. But then the album gets really strong with the track Contemplate, which is one of those heavily intense neurofunk tracks. Amazing bass line, it's a really sick sound. And then we go to some of those darker tracks that have a bit of an old school vibe. Main example, the track Dead Out. Even though the track itself is another neurofunk banger, the beginning, the intro on this thing, it sounds a lot like some old school Current Value having this horror aesthetic to it, with these slow and creepy hi-hats and a huge amount of different samples that feel like they've been taken out of horror movies, and it makes for an aesthetic that I haven't seen Current Value put out for a very long time in a track, and it really fits on this one and it works really well. Then we have songs like Catch Up, which has easily the creepiest and the most horrifying introduction to this album. It gave me a vibe from back to the old days of Current Value, where his music would be extremely dark and creepy, and also the beat on this thing is really sick and goes closer to some of his older stuff. It doesn't have the same amount of intensity, but it's still darker and more intense than more of his recent outputs. Then we have tracks like Vicious Circle, which is a track that goes more into this heavy neurofunk side. However, the introduction to this thing is also a bit horrifying, and it sounds like a combination from the intros of the tracks Twisted and Full Spectrum Warrior. It feels like a combination on those two being on this track. And then we have Silly Serious, which actually features some military drum and bass stuff, something that is also an old school sound from Current Value that he experimented with in the late 2000s and the early 2010s, and it's definitely one of the most heavy and one of the most intense tracks, which sounds a lot like Uncertainty Principle, which was one of my favorite tracks out of the album Quantum Physics. Overall though, the rest of the album still follows the standard formula of neurofunk that you would expect out of this new Current Value album, since most of his recent outputs go into this particular sound, but still this one manages to have a bit of a throwback to some of his older stuff. This one actually feels like it has a combination of some of his old school stuff, some of his more throwback sounds, but combined with a weird approach on some of his newer sounds. And the result has some really incredible tracks, and definitely one of the most unique efforts he has put out over the past couple of years. Halfway towards the album though, there are a few moments that were not as impressive. For example, the track Pitting was a track that wasn't as intense, it felt a bit awkward. And then there's the track Remorse featuring Coppa, which was actually one of the teaser tracks from this album, and it actually got me really worried because I didn't really enjoy this track when I first listened to it, and the track hasn't been any better since I heard the whole thing and I listened to the track again and again. I think it's one of the weaker efforts from Current Value recently. I like that this track actually features an MC rapping to this song. This is something that we don't usually see Current Value having as a part in his songs, but still I don't think that Coppa had a great sort of delivery, and the track itself felt really unimaginative, which was not the case whatsoever with his first teaser track AVGR, which is the last track on the album, which is easily one of my favorite moments of this album, if not my favorite. I love this track, I love its intensity. It's definitely one of the most well thought out neurofunk tracks Current Value has ever done. Another track I didn't enjoy as much was the track Motiv. I appreciate that Current Value decided to make another song with no beat, just ambient electro sounds, but still this is a track that it doesn't feel that well developed and the sounds are not that incredible. I still think that Current Value needs to do a job on some of those tracks that don't contain a beat if he's still going to go into that direction, because there is the potential, but tracks like Motiv, for example, feel a bit empty. Then, like I said, there are tracks that go to this more soft side of things, like the track Starliner, and then there are other tracks like Running Your Mouth and Dead Companion, which are more sweet and more beautiful. Also, some of the tracks like Melt and Call of the Wild have some interesting features from artists like Serum and Levela, and also Dead Out featuring T.I., which are all artists that have been part on Souped Up Records, so it makes sense for them to be on this album. Overall, I could say a lot more about this album, but I honestly just recommend you to go and listen to this thing. This is quite an exceptional work from Current Value. It might not be one of my favorites, since there are tracks that I'm not really that much of a fan fan of, but it's definitely one of the most unique and one of the most varied albums Current Value has ever done in his career. And it's great to see him constantly developing himself over the years. This album has amazing production, the sound of it is incredible, there are some really good ideas, and yeah, other than that, I definitely recommend this album to you. It's definitely one of the best neurofunk releases you can find from this year. I'm going to give this album a 7 plus out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.